In the early morning darkness of February 29th, 1944, Lieutenant Kiyoshi Watanabe stood at his observation post on the cliffs of Rabaul and watched the horizon. He had been watching for weeks. Every night, he expected to see the silhouettes of American warships emerging from the blackness, coming to claim what Japanese Imperial Headquarters had called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. His rifle was clean. His ammunition was stacked neatly beside him. He had written his final letter home 3 weeks earlier, sealed it, and placed it in his footlocker. He was ready to die. But the Americans never came. Instead, that morning, Watanabe received a decoded intelligence report that would haunt him for the rest of his life. American forces had landed on Los Negros Island in the Admiralty Group, 360 miles to the northwest. They had bypassed Rabaul entirely. The fortress that housed over 97,000 Japanese troops, the base that had taken 2 years to fortify, the position that was supposed to anchor Japan's entire defensive perimeter in the southwest Pacific, MacArthur had simply sailed past it. Watanabe wrote in his diary that night, "I do not understand this kind of war. We are ready to fight. We want to fight. But the enemy has decided we are not worth fighting." This was not the terror of combat. This was something else entirely. This was the slow, creeping realization that you had been made strategically irrelevant while you still had bullets in your gun. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why MacArthur's island-hopping strategy induced such profound psychological dread in Japanese forces, we must first understand what Japanese military doctrine expected war in the Pacific to look like. In the winter of 1942, after a stunning series of victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Japanese Imperial Headquarters believed they had discovered the formula for defeating American military power. The strategy was called Jikyusen prolonged warfare. The principle was straightforward. Force the Americans into costly, methodical frontal assaults on heavily fortified positions. Make them pay in blood for every island, every airfield, every harbor. String out the war until American public opinion, horrified by mounting casualties and endless expenditure, would demand a negotiated peace that left Japan in control of its newly conquered empire. This wasn't mere wishful thinking. It was based on careful analysis of American political culture and recent military history. Japanese strategists had studied the American Civil War, noting how Northern public opinion had nearly collapsed despite the Union's material superiority. They had watched American intervention in the First World War, noting how quickly public enthusiasm had waned once casualties mounted. They believed, with some justification, that American democracy's greatest vulnerability was its sensitivity to casualties. If Japan could make the cost of victory unbearable, America would seek terms. The strategy had worked brilliantly in the early stages of the Pacific War. At Wake Island in December 1941, 450 American defenders had held out for 15 days against overwhelming Japanese force, inflicting significant casualties. The Americans had been lauded as heroes, but they had ultimately surrendered or died. At Bataan in April 1942, 76,000 American and Filipino troops had been forced to surrender after 3 months of desperate resistance. These were exactly the kind of grinding, attritional battles Japanese doctrine anticipated. Yes, Japan had won, but more importantly, Americans had been forced to fight the kind of war Japan wanted them to fight. The real test of this strategy came at Guadalcanal. Beginning in August 1942, American Marines landed on this insignificant island in the Solomon Chain and began building an airfield. What followed was exactly what Japanese planners had hoped for, a 6-month bloodbath. The Americans threw division after division into the jungle. Naval battles raged offshore with such ferocity that the strait between Guadalcanal and Florida Island became known as Iron Bottom Sound for all the ships that rested on the seafloor. By the time Japanese forces withdrew in February 1943, over 7,000 Americans were dead or missing. Japan had lost the island, yes, but they had made America pay. Japanese commanders studied the battle reports from Guadalcanal with grim satisfaction. The mathematics seemed to prove their thesis. If it cost 7,000 American lives to take one relatively small island, and if there were dozens of such islands between the American lines and the Japanese home islands, and if each one could be turned into another Guadalcanal, then the total butcher's bill would force America to the negotiating table long before American forces reached Tokyo. This calculation shaped every aspect of Japanese defensive planning in 1943. Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, became the cornerstone of the entire defensive perimeter. The Japanese poured men and materiel into the base throughout 1942 and early 1943. By mid-1943, Rabaul hosted over 97,000 troops, more than 300 aircraft, and substantial naval forces. The harbour could accommodate multiple heavy cruisers. The surrounding jungle had been carved into a maze of bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions. If Guadalcanal had cost the Americans 7,000 dead for a minor island, how many would it cost them to take Rabaul? Japanese military planners estimated that assaulting Rabaul directly would require at least 6 American divisions over 100,000 men and would result in at least 25,000 American casualties, possibly more. They expected the battle to last 3 to 6 months. They were prepared to sacrifice every man in the garrison if necessary. This was the essence of Gyokusai shattering the jewel, the doctrine that called for Japanese forces to fight to the death, inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy even in defeat. Death in battle was not just acceptable, it was the highest honor a Japanese soldier could achieve. But these calculations rested on one fundamental assumption, that the Americans would actually attack Rabaul. Douglas MacArthur had left the Philippines in March 1942 under orders from President Roosevelt, evacuating to Australia as Japanese forces overwhelmed American and Filipino defenders. His departure, though necessary, was humiliating. Standing on a dock in Melbourne, MacArthur had made his famous promise, "I shall return." But as he studied the maps in his new headquarters, the path back to the Philippines seemed impossibly long and impossibly bloody. Between Australia and Manila lay thousands of miles of Japanese-held territory, and sitting right in the middle of that route was Rabaul. MacArthur's staff officers laid out the problem in stark terms. Taking Rabaul head-on would cost tens of thousands of casualties, but bypassing it seemed equally impossible. Rabaul's aircraft could strike shipping lanes across a radius of 500 miles. Its cruisers and destroyers could raid supply convoys. Conventional military wisdom held that you could not simply leave such a powerful base in your rear. Your supply lines would be constantly threatened. You would be fighting with one eye, always looking backward. Standard doctrine said you had to neutralize major enemy strongpoints before advancing further. But MacArthur had noticed something in the intelligence reports that crossed his desk. Something that would fundamentally change not just the Pacific War, but the nature of modern warfare itself. Japanese defensive positions, no matter how heavily fortified, had a critical vulnerability. They depended entirely on supply from the sea. Rabaul's 97,000 troops consumed enormous quantities of food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies every week. None of this could be produced locally. All of it had to be shipped in from the Japanese home islands or from captured territories to the north. The supply convoys had to follow predictable routes through narrow straits and channels, and those convoys were vulnerable. MacArthur proposed something that his own staff initially thought was reckless. Bypass Rabaul entirely. Don't attack it. Don't even threaten it directly. Instead, seize smaller islands that controlled the sea lanes around Rabaul. Cut off the supply convoys, build airfields on these seized islands and use them to dominate the surrounding waters. Make it impossible for Japanese ships to reach Rabaul. Then simply move on, leaving Rabaul's massive garrison to wither on the vine. The proposal was met with considerable skepticism. MacArthur's Chief of Staff, General Richard Sutherland, pointed out the obvious risks. What if the Japanese garrison at Rabaul broke out? What if they launched spoiling attacks against American supply lines? What if bypassing such a large enemy force violated basic military principles so thoroughly that it led to disaster? MacArthur's response was coldly logical. Japanese doctrine, he explained, was built around Gyokusai, honorable death in battle. Japanese commanders were psychologically conditioned to stand and fight, not to maneuver. They would wait in their fortifications for the Americans to attack, because attacking was what their honor demanded of them. More importantly, Japanese strategic reserves were limited. Every soldier committed to Rabaul was a soldier unavailable elsewhere. As long as those 97,000 troops stayed at Rabaul, waiting for an assault that never came, they were effectively removed from the war at zero cost in American lives. Admiral William Halsey, commander of naval forces in the South Pacific, understood MacArthur's logic but worried about the implementation. Bypassing Rabaul meant that American supply convoys would have to sail within range of Japanese aircraft and warships. The risk was substantial. MacArthur acknowledged the risk, but argued that building airfields on bypassed islands that were lightly defended specifically because the Japanese had concentrated so heavily at Rabaul, would create an air umbrella that could protect the supply routes. American aircraft flying from these newly seized bases could intercept Japanese attempts to interdict shipping. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington approved MacArthur's plan in the spring of 1943, but with considerable reservation. The official directive gave MacArthur permission to isolate Rabaul rather than assault it, but made clear that if the strategy failed, the responsibility would rest entirely on MacArthur's shoulders. He was, in effect, betting his career on a radical reinterpretation of how offensive warfare should be conducted. The campaign began in June 1943, with landings in the Trobriand Islands and at Nassau Bay on the New Guinea coast. These were small operations, involving only a few thousand troops, but they established a pattern. American forces would strike at a lightly defended position, seize it quickly, and immediately begin construction of an airfield. Once the airfield was operational, American aircraft could dominate the surrounding seas and skies, making it nearly impossible for Japanese forces to counterattack or to reinforce other nearby positions. Then, MacArthur's forces would leap forward again to the next lightly defended target. To Japanese commanders watching this pattern develop, it initially seemed almost random. The Americans weren't following any logical geographic sequence. They weren't systematically clearing territory. They were hopping seemingly at random from one position to another, but there was a method to the apparent madness. Every position, MacArthur seized controlled sea lanes or provided airfields that extended American air cover further north and west. Each leap bypassed Japanese strongpoints, leaving them isolated and increasingly irrelevant. In September 1943, American forces landed at Lae on New Guinea's northern coast, just 300 miles from Rabaul. Japanese defenders at Rabaul prepared for the inevitable assault on their fortress. Surely, they thought, the Americans would now turn toward Rabaul itself. But MacArthur's forces continued moving west along the New Guinea coast, away from Rabaul. In December 1943, Americans landed at Cape Gloucester on the western tip of New Britain, the same island that housed Rabaul at its eastern end, but made no move toward the Japanese fortress just 200 miles away. By the end of 1943, the psychological impact on Japanese forces was becoming evident. Lieutenant Watanabe's diary entries from this period reveal a growing sense of bewilderment. "We are told the Americans fear to attack us," he wrote in November. "But if they fear us, why do they keep moving past us? Why do they seem so unconcerned with our presence?" This wasn't the bravado of a soldier eager for battle. It was the confusion of someone whose entire understanding of warfare was being systematically dismantled. The real acceleration of MacArthur's strategy came in early 1944. On February 29th, the same morning, Watanabe watched from his observation post. American forces conducted an amphibious assault on Los Negros Island in the Admiralty Group. The landing force was relatively small, just over 1,000 troops from the 1st Cavalry Division. The Japanese garrison on Los Negros numbered only about 4,000, and many of these were construction troops rather than combat infantry. Within 4 days, Americans controlled the island. Within 2 weeks, they had built an airfield. The strategic implications were devastating for Japanese planning. Los Negros sits 360 miles northwest of Rabaul, positioned perfectly to interdict any supply convoys trying to reach the fortress. American aircraft flying from Los Negros could cover nearly all the sea approaches to Rabaul. More importantly, Los Negros provided MacArthur with a major forward base for the next leap, one that completely bypassed not just Rabaul, but the entire chain of Japanese defensive positions along the New Guinea coast. For Japanese commanders, this was the moment the full horror of MacArthur's strategy became apparent. It wasn't just that Americans were bypassing individual positions, they were bypassing entire defensive lines. All the careful preparation, all the fortifications built over 2 years, all the troops concentrated at supposedly critical points, all of it had been rendered irrelevant in a matter of weeks. Major Yoshitaka Hori, a staff officer at Imperial Headquarters in Tokyo, later wrote that February and March of 1944 marked a fundamental crisis in Japanese strategic thinking. "We realized," he wrote, "that we had spent 2 years preparing for a kind of war that our enemy had decided not to fight. We had built fortresses. The Americans simply drew new maps that did not include our fortresses. We had concentrated our forces. The Americans found gaps we did not know existed. It was not that we were losing battles. We were not being permitted to fight battles at all." This realization created a cascade of strategic problems for Japanese planners. If Americans could bypass Rabaul, the strongest position in the Southwest Pacific, then they could bypass anything. This meant that every defensive position was potentially irrelevant. But if every position might be bypassed, how could commanders decide where to concentrate forces? The logical response would be to spread forces more evenly, defending everything. But Japan's manpower and logistics couldn't support that. There weren't enough troops and supplies to defend every possible landing site across thousands of miles of coastline. Japanese commanders were caught in an impossible dilemma. They couldn't defend everything, but they couldn't predict where MacArthur would strike next. His leaps seemed to follow no discernible pattern. One landing would be separated from the previous one by just 100 miles. The next leap would cover 400 miles. Sometimes he would strike at the New Guinea coast, sometimes at islands to the north. The unpredictability was strategic, and it was devastating. In April 1944, MacArthur demonstrated just how far this strategy could reach. On April 22nd, American forces conducted simultaneous landings at Hollandia and Aitape on the northern coast of New Guinea. Hollandia was 500 miles beyond the nearest American position, by far the longest leap yet attempted. The landings bypassed 18,000 Japanese troops concentrated at Wewak, positioned directly between the previous American positions and Hollandia. The Wewak garrison was well supplied and strongly fortified. Japanese commanders there had expected to be MacArthur's next target. They had positioned troops for a defensive battle, stockpiled ammunition, and prepared their bunkers. The commanding officer, Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, had issued orders for a fight to the death. His troops were ready, but on the morning of April 22nd, they watched American ships sail past on the horizon, heading northwest. The Americans landed at Hollandia, 300 miles beyond Wewak, seizing the position in 3 days against light resistance. General Adachi faced a problem that would soon become familiar to Japanese commanders across the Pacific. What do you do when the enemy decides you don't matter? His troops were combat effective. They had ammunition, they had the will to fight, but they had been strategically nullified. American aircraft flying from newly captured bases prevented any Japanese ships from reaching Wewak with supplies. The garrison's food stocks would last perhaps 3 months if rationed carefully. After that, starvation. Adachi could order his troops to attack American positions, but the nearest American base was now hundreds of miles away across jungle terrain with no roads. Any attack would take weeks to organize and would leave his troops vulnerable to air attack during the entire march. Adachi chose to wait. His orders from Imperial headquarters were to defend Wewak. He would follow his orders. But waiting, in this context, meant slow death. Supply ships stopped arriving in May 1944. By June, soldiers were on half rations. By August, they were eating whatever they could find, in the jungle roots, insects, occasionally rats. Malaria ravaged the garrison. So did dengue fever, dysentery, and beriberi from malnutrition. Men died not in glorious battle, but in hospital tents from diseases that could have been prevented with adequate supplies. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto, a member of the Wewak garrison, kept a diary throughout 1944. His entries chart the psychological disintegration that accompanied physical decline. In May, we await orders to engage the enemy. All men are determined. In July, food is scarce but morale remains high. We are warriors of the Emperor. In September, 3 men died of sickness yesterday. I wonder if the Americans remember we are here. In November, I think about food constantly. I dreamed last night of rice. Just rice. I cannot remember what a full stomach feels like. By December 1944, the Wewak garrison had effectively ceased to exist as a military force. Of the original 18,000 troops, fewer than 2,000 remained combat effective. Over 13,000 were dead, mostly from disease and starvation. The survivors were too weak to fight, even if given the opportunity. When Australian forces finally reached Wewak in May 1945 to accept the garrison's surrender, they found men so emaciated that many could barely stand. And here is the most brutal statistic of MacArthur's island-hopping strategy. Not a single American soldier died in combat taking Wewak, because Americans never attacked Wewak. They didn't need to. They had simply made it irrelevant. If you find this story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This pattern repeated across the Southwest Pacific throughout 1944. On May 17th, American forces landed on Wakda Island, bypassing Japanese positions at Sami. On May 27th, they seized Biak Island, bypassing more garrisons. On July 30th, they took Sansapor on New Guinea's western tip. Each leap bypassed thousands of Japanese troops. Each garrison left behind faced the same slow deterioration that had consumed Wewak. But the psychological impact extended far beyond the bypassed garrisons themselves. It reached back to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, where staff officers struggled to understand how to counter a strategy that seemed to violate every principle of warfare they had been taught. Japanese military doctrine, developed over decades and refined through campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, emphasized concentration of force, preparation of defensive positions, and determined resistance. MacArthur's strategy rendered all three principles obsolete. Concentration meant nothing if the concentrated force was never engaged. Preparation meant nothing if the prepared position was bypassed. Determined resistance meant nothing if there was no enemy to resist. Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the most influential strategic planners in the Imperial Japanese Army, wrote a classified analysis in June 1944 that was later captured and translated by American intelligence. His assessment was brutally honest. We face an enemy who has discovered that modern warfare is not about occupying territory, but about occupying strategic positions. They have recognized that fortifications are useful only if the enemy chooses to attack them. General MacArthur has chosen not to attack fortifications. This choice was available to Japanese commanders in China, but we did not make it. We believed in the virtue of systematically securing territory. The Americans believe only in securing victory by the most economical means. This difference in philosophy may prove decisive. Tsuji's analysis identified the core psychological challenge facing Japanese forces. Japanese military culture, steeped in Bushido traditions, valorized self-sacrifice and death in battle. The highest honor a soldier could achieve was to die fighting for the emperor. This cultural framework created soldiers of extraordinary bravery and determination, soldiers who would fight to the death rather than surrender, who would launch suicide attacks against overwhelming odds, who would endure appalling conditions without complaint. But this same cultural framework created a critical vulnerability when confronted with an enemy who refused to provide the opportunity for honorable death in combat. The soldiers bypassed by MacArthur's advance faced a fate that Japanese military tradition had never contemplated: irrelevance. They could not die gloriously in battle because there was no battle. They could not sacrifice themselves for strategic gain because their positions had no strategic value. They could not even surrender honorably because there was no enemy present to surrender to. They simply sat in their fortifications and slowly wasted away, forgotten by both sides. This wasn't merely a tactical problem, it was an existential crisis. What does it mean to be a warrior if no one considers you worth fighting? What does it mean to be dangerous if the enemy finds it more efficient to ignore you than to destroy you? These questions haunted the bypassed garrisons, and the answers destroyed morale more effectively than any artillery barrage could have. Commander Yoshitake Miwa, a naval officer stationed at Rabaul, documented this psychological deterioration in his personal journal. Before 1944, his entries reflected the confidence typical of Japanese military personnel in the early war period. He wrote about the inevitability of American defeat, the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit, the honor of serving the emperor. But by mid-1944, his tone had changed completely. June 14th, 1944, he wrote, "Another ship spotted on the horizon. Another convoy that does not stop here. We have ample supplies for now, but we all understand what this means. The Americans have chosen their targets, and we are not among them. I do not know if this reflects their contempt for our strength or their recognition that we are no longer relevant to their plans. Perhaps both. Perhaps it does not matter." Later entries became even darker. August 3rd, 1944. We received news that American forces have landed in the Marianas. The Marianas are over 1,800 miles from here. The Americans are now closer to Tokyo than we are. We remain in our positions, following orders, maintaining discipline. But we know, we have become a garrison without purpose. We are defending a position that no one intends to attack, guarding approaches to territory that the enemy has already bypassed. There is no honor in this. But there is also no dishonor, because dishonor requires an audience. We have been forgotten. The most psychologically devastating aspect of this experience was the inversion of expectation. Japanese soldiers had been trained to expect a certain kind of war. They would face a ruthless enemy determined to destroy them. The battles would be terrible. Many would die. But they would die as warriors, facing their enemies, selling their lives dearly, achieving immortality through sacrifice. This was the narrative framework that gave meaning to military service. This was why young men volunteered. This was why families sent their sons off with pride rather than grief. MacArthur's island-hopping strategy destroyed this narrative. The expected story brave Japanese defenders dying gloriously while inflicting heavy casualties on the attackers never materialized. Instead, the bypassed garrisons experienced something closer to abandonment, not by their own commanders, who continued to issue orders and maintain the chain of command as long as communications allowed, but abandonment by the enemy, who had essentially declared these garrisons not worth the trouble of fighting. This inversion had broader implications for Japanese strategic morale. Throughout 1944, as MacArthur's advance accelerated, Japanese commanders faced an impossible choice at every potential defensive position: concentrate forces and risk being bypassed, or spread forces thin and risk being overwhelmed at any point the Americans chose to attack. Either choice could prove fatal. The unpredictability of MacArthur's targeting made it impossible to determine which choice was correct until after the Americans had already made their move. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who became Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in May 1944, confronted this dilemma repeatedly. Intelligence reports showed American forces massing for an operation, but where would they strike? Every week, Toyoda's staff produced estimates of likely American objectives. Every week, MacArthur struck somewhere other than the predicted target. By July 1944, Toyoda had essentially stopped trying to predict American moves and instead focused on maintaining mobile reserves that could respond to American landings after they occurred. But this reactive strategy meant yielding the initiative entirely to MacArthur, and it proved inadequate against the speed of American advances. The material reality behind MacArthur's strategy was American industrial production combined with growing air and naval superiority. By mid-1944, American shipyards were producing escort carriers, destroyers, and amphibious assault ships at a rate that Japan could not match even in peacetime, much less under sustained American submarine and air attack. This production capacity allowed MacArthur to maintain multiple simultaneous operations, keeping Japanese commanders constantly off balance. Equally important was American air superiority. Each position MacArthur seized became home to another airfield within days of its capture. American construction battalions, the famous Seabees, could carve an operational airstrip out of jungle in less than a week, using heavy machinery that Japanese forces in the Pacific could only dream of. These airfields created overlapping bubbles of air cover that protected American supply lines and prevented Japanese forces from concentrating for counterattacks. Any Japanese troop movement of more than a few dozen men would be spotted by American patrol aircraft and subject to devastating air attack. The logistical dimension of island hopping was as important as the strategic dimension. MacArthur's forces could leap hundreds of miles precisely because American logistics could support such leaps. Each assault wave brought not just combat troops but supply ships, construction equipment, medical facilities, and enough materiel to sustain operations for weeks, even if supply lines were temporarily disrupted. Japanese forces, by contrast, were chronically short of everything: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, spare parts. This asymmetry meant that bypassed Japanese garrisons deteriorated rapidly while American forces continued to grow stronger. Consider the specific case of Rabaul, the position that opened this narrative. In January 1944, Rabaul hosted 97,000 troops and was arguably the strongest Japanese position in the Pacific outside the home islands. By June 1944, those 97,000 troops were still present, still armed, still occupying their fortifications, but they were also completely irrelevant to the course of the war. No American forces were within 300 miles. American aircraft had neutralized Rabaul's airfields through sustained bombing, destroying hangars and cratering runways faster than Japanese construction crews could repair them. American submarines and aircraft had made the sea approaches to Rabaul so dangerous that supply convoys stopped attempting the run. The material degradation at Rabaul was slower than at smaller garrisons like Wewak because Rabaul had larger supply stockpiles, but the psychological degradation was equally profound. General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army headquartered at Rabaul, maintained strict discipline and order among his troops, even as he recognized the futility of their position. His messages to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo grew increasingly desperate throughout 1944. Not begging for relief, he knew no relief was possible, but requesting permission to abandon Rabaul and attack American positions to the west, seeking an honorable death in battle rather than slow starvation in a meaningless garrison. Tokyo denied these requests. The official reasoning was that Rabaul's garrison, simply by existing, tied down American forces that might otherwise be deployed elsewhere. This reasoning was flawed. MacArthur had already moved on and was not dedicating significant resources to containing Rabaul, but it reflected a deeper Japanese strategic paralysis. Imperial headquarters could not admit, even to itself, that 100,000 troops had been rendered useless. Admitting that would mean admitting the bankruptcy of the entire defensive strategy. So Rabaul's garrison was ordered to remain in position, waiting for attacks that would never come, while the war moved on without them. The human cost of this strategic irrelevance is difficult to quantify precisely, but the available records suggest staggering waste. At Rabaul, approximately 14,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors died between January 1944 and the end of the war in August 1945. Only a tiny fraction of these deaths, fewer than 1,000, resulted from American combat action. The rest died from disease, malnutrition, and accidents. The death rate among bypassed garrisons across the Pacific was similar. In total, historians estimate that over 150,000 Japanese military personnel died in bypassed positions during 1944 and 1945, the vast majority from non-combat causes. To put this in context, more Japanese soldiers died of starvation and disease in bypassed garrisons than were killed in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. This comparison is not meant to diminish the horror of the atomic bombings, but rather to illustrate the brutal mathematics of MacArthur's strategy. Island hopping killed enormous numbers of Japanese soldiers, not through combat, but through the slow erosion of their ability to sustain themselves. And it did so at virtually no cost in American lives. The true test of MacArthur's island-hopping strategy came in October 1944 with the return to the Philippines. MacArthur had promised in March 1942 that he would return, and he intended to keep that promise. But between Australia and Manila lay not just distance, but the accumulated defensive positions of 2.5 years of Japanese preparation. Traditional military thinking would have required systematic reduction of each position. MacArthur simply bypassed the majority of them. On October 20th, 1944, American forces landed at Leyte in the central Philippines. The landing force was massive, over 200,000 troops supported by 700 ships. This was no raid or probe, this was a full-scale invasion. But the choice of Leyte itself reflected island-hopping principles. Leyte was not the strongest Japanese position in the Philippines. That distinction belonged to Luzon, where over 250,000 Japanese troops were concentrated. By landing at Leyte in the Central Islands, MacArthur forced Japanese commanders to choose: reinforce Leyte and risk American landings elsewhere, or hold forces back and concede Leyte. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Japanese commander in the Philippines, and the man who had conquered Singapore in 1942 with brilliant tactical maneuvering, chose to fight for Leyte. He dispatched reinforcements from Luzon despite the risk. This decision played directly into MacArthur's hands. Every soldier sent to Leyte was a soldier unavailable to defend Luzon. More importantly, the troop transports carrying reinforcements had to run a gauntlet of American aircraft and submarines. Japanese records indicate that over 10,000 reinforcements were killed en route to Leyte, drowned when their ships were sunk, never reaching the battle they had been sent to fight. The Battle of Leyte lasted until late December 1944 and resulted in Japanese defeat. But the real strategic victory for MacArthur came in January 1945, when American forces landed on Luzon, bypassing Japanese positions throughout the central and southern Philippines. Thousands of Japanese troops remained scattered across islands like Mindanao, Cebu, and Negros. These garrisons were well armed and ready to fight, but MacArthur left them for Filipino guerrilla forces and Australian troops to contain while he drove toward Manila with his main force. The pattern established in New Guinea repeated itself in the Philippines. Japanese garrisons that had been preparing for months to resist American invasion watched American convoys sail past. They remained in their positions, following orders, maintaining discipline, slowly consuming their limited supplies, while the decisive battles occurred hundreds of miles away. Colonel Masaharu Kojima commanded a garrison of 8,000 troops on Mindanao throughout 1945. His position controlled significant territory in the island's interior. His troops had adequate ammunition and defensible positions, but after American landings on Luzon in January, no further American forces came to Mindanao. Filipino guerrillas harassed the garrison's perimeter, but no major assault developed. Kojima's messages to higher headquarters, when communications were still possible, reflected growing confusion about his mission. What was he defending? What was he accomplishing? His troops were combat-ready, but there was no combat. In April 1945, Kojima received fragmentary reports that American forces had landed on Okinawa, less than 400 miles from the Japanese home islands. The war had moved past the Philippines entirely. Mindanao, which Japanese planners in 1942 had considered a critical position for defending the southern approaches to Japan, had become a strategic afterthought. Kojima's garrison would remain in the interior of Mindanao until Japan's surrender in August, by which point over 3,000 of his troops were dead from malaria, dengue fever, and malnutrition. The psychological impact of being bypassed was particularly acute for soldiers who had participated in Japan's early victories. Many of the troops in bypassed garrisons had fought in Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, or the early Philippines, campaign of 1941 and 1942. They had experienced the intoxication of rapid victory, the sense that Japanese forces were invincible, that Western colonial powers were weak and decadent. The reversal from conquerors to forgotten garrison troops was psychologically shattering. Sergeant Major Toshio Nakamura had participated in the capture of Singapore in February 1942, one of the greatest victories in Japanese military history. He was subsequently posted to a garrison on New Ireland, near Rabaul. In his diary, Nakamura described the psychological whiplash of his experience. In Singapore, he wrote in March 1942, "We were warriors of the Emperor, carrying out the divine mission to liberate Asia from Western imperialism. The British surrendered. We entered the city as heroes. I felt pride that I cannot adequately describe. 2 years later, his tone had changed completely. April 1944, we heard today that American forces have bypassed us. They landed somewhere to the north. We are to remain in position. I do not understand why. We are ready to fight. We want to fight. But the enemy has decided we are not worth their attention. How does one find meaning in this? I was a warrior in Singapore. What am I now? A guard watching over empty jungle." Nakamura's diary entries became increasingly sparse as 1944 progressed. The final entry, dated November 1944, consisted of a single sentence, "Rice ration reduced again. I am hungry all the time now." The collapse of morale in bypassed garrisons followed a predictable pattern. Initially, troops maintained discipline and combat readiness, expecting the Americans to eventually attack. When weeks passed without attack, confusion set in. When months passed, the psychological strain became evident. Soldiers began questioning the purpose of their sacrifice. Why maintain fighting positions if there would be no fight? Why ration food strictly if the enemy had no intention of attacking? Why continue at all? Japanese military discipline generally prevented open mutiny, but it could not prevent psychological disintegration. Commanders reported increasing rates of what modern military psychology would recognize as depression, listlessness, inability to concentrate, loss of appetite beyond what malnutrition alone would explain. Some soldiers simply stopped functioning. They would sit for hours staring at nothing. They stopped maintaining their weapons. They stopped caring about survival. Lieutenant Yoshio Kodama, a medical officer at a bypassed garrison in the Admiralty Islands, kept detailed records of the mental and physical health of the troops under his care. His reports, captured after the war, make for grim reading. By July 1944, he wrote, "We had virtually no medical supplies remaining. I could do nothing for men suffering from malaria except try to keep them hydrated. But the psychological cases were worse because I had never been trained to address them. Men would come to sick call complaining of nothing specific. They simply did not want to continue. When I asked what hurt, they could not answer. When I asked what they needed, they said they did not know. I realized they were asking me to give them a reason to continue living, and I had no answer to give them. The diaries and letters from bypassed garrisons reveal a recurring theme: the search for meaning in meaninglessness. Soldiers tried to construct narratives that made sense of their situation. Some convinced themselves that they were tying down American resources, that even though Americans had bypassed them, the mere existence of their garrison forced Americans to maintain patrols and allocate forces to containment. This narrative was largely false. MacArthur generally left bypassed positions to guerrilla forces or minimal Allied units, while his main forces drove forward. But the narrative provided psychological comfort, a way to believe that suffering had purpose. Others embraced a more mystical interpretation. They were enduring this trial as a test of spirit. The Americans, they told themselves, had bypassed them not because they were irrelevant, but because they were too formidable to assault. Their suffering was proof of their dedication to the Emperor. This narrative was equally false but equally comforting. It allowed soldiers to reframe their abandonment as a form of recognition, but these comforting narratives became harder to maintain as time passed. By late 1944, even the most disciplined garrisons were experiencing severe material deprivation. At Rabaul, where supply stockpiles had been substantial, the garrison had shifted entirely to locally sourced food by September 1944. This meant whatever could be grown in gardens carved from jungle, whatever could be hunted or fished, whatever wild plants were edible. The caloric intake per soldier dropped from approximately 3,000 calories per day in early 1944 to fewer than 1,000 calories per day by late 1944. Men lost weight rapidly, muscle mass disappeared. The garrison had ample ammunition, but increasingly lacked the physical strength to use weapons effectively. The irony was not lost on the soldiers experiencing it. They had been bypassed because they were too strong to attack directly, but being bypassed had made them weak. By early 1945, the Rabaul garrison, still numbering over 80,000 troops, was essentially combat ineffective despite having weapons and fortifications. If Americans had attacked at that point, the emaciated defenders would have struggled to mount effective resistance. But Americans did not attack because there was no strategic reason to attack. Rabaul had become a self-contained prison camp, its inmates kept captive not by walls, but by the impossibility of leaving. General Imamura, the Rabaul commander, maintained discipline through force of personality and appeals to duty. He instituted an aggressive agricultural program, requiring troops to cultivate every available piece of land. He organized fishing expeditions and hunting parties. He rationed the garrison's dwindling fuel supplies to ensure that critical communications equipment could still function. But he could not solve the fundamental problem. Rabaul hosted far more troops than the local environment could sustain. No amount of gardening or fishing could provide adequate calories for 80,000 men. Imamura's correspondence with Imperial headquarters in Tokyo reveals his frustration. In a message dated February 19th, 1945, intercepted and decoded by American intelligence, Imamura requested permission to evacuate Rabaul's garrison by submarine and small craft, accepting enormous casualties during the evacuation in exchange for the possibility that at least some troops might reach positions where they could contribute to Japan's defense. Tokyo's response was unequivocal. Remain in position. The official justification was that Rabaul's garrison, simply by existing, served a strategic purpose. The actual reason was that Tokyo had no place to send 80,000 additional troops, and no ships available to evacuate them, even if there had been. So Rabaul's garrison remained, slowly starving, while the war moved toward its climax without them. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, some soldiers at Rabaul learned of it through forbidden radio listening. The news was psychologically devastating. If Germany had fallen, how could Japan possibly win? What were they suffering for? But openly discussing such questions was treasonous. So soldiers kept their doubts private and continued following orders, maintained their positions, and waited for something, anything, to give their suffering meaning. The endgame of MacArthur's island-hopping strategy played out not in the Pacific, but in the skies over Japan. By mid-1945, American B-29 bombers were systematically destroying Japanese cities. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August occurred while over 150,000 Japanese troops sat in bypassed garrisons across the Pacific, unable to contribute anything to their nation's defense. They heard about these events through fragmentary communications when communications functioned at all, and understood that the war was ending in catastrophic defeat. But they could not leave their positions. They could not even surrender without orders, so they waited. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. For most bypassed garrisons, confirming this announcement took days or even weeks. Communications networks had largely broken down. Some garrisons received direct messages from higher headquarters. Others heard rumors from local fast populations or saw leaflets dropped by Allied aircraft. The initial reaction was often disbelief. After years of propaganda insisting that Japan would never surrender, that defeat was impossible, that every Japanese citizen would die before accepting occupation, the reality of unconditional surrender was incomprehensible. At Rabaul, General Imamura received official notification of the surrender on August 16th. He assembled his senior officers and read them the emperor's message. Several officers wept. Some argued for continuing resistance despite the emperor's command, a position that, in traditional Japanese military culture, bordered on mutiny but reflected the depth of their psychological investment in the war. Imamura rejected these arguments. The emperor had spoken. The war was over. They would surrender with dignity. But what did surrender mean for troops who had not been fighting? The Allied officers who arrived at Rabaul in September 1945 to formalize the surrender found a garrison that existed in a strange liminal state. These were soldiers who had been militarily defeated without experiencing military defeat. They had lost the war while sitting in fortifications they had never been asked to defend. They had been conquered by being ignored. Australian Lieutenant Colonel J.K. Murray, who participated in accepting the Rabaul garrison's surrender, later wrote about the experience. "I expected to find defeated soldiers, demoralized, perhaps resentful, possibly dangerous. Instead, I found men who seemed almost relieved, not relieved that the war was over, though certainly there was some of that, relieved that their ordeal of irrelevance had ended. They had been in a kind of purgatory, neither truly at war nor truly at peace. Surrender brought a resolution of sorts, even if the resolution was unfavorable. The formal surrender ceremonies at bypassed garrisons throughout the Pacific had a surreal quality. Japanese officers would present their swords to Allied commanders in the traditional gesture of surrender. But in many cases, these officers had never commanded their troops in battle. The weapons being surrendered had never been fired at the enemy. The fortifications being handed over had never been attacked. The entire ritual was a formalization of a defeat that had already occurred months or years earlier, when MacArthur's forces had sailed past and decided these positions did not matter. For the individual soldiers in bypassed garrisons, the surrender brought a strange mixture of relief and despair. Relief that the suffering would end, that they would receive food, medical care, and eventually passage home. Despair that their suffering had been for nothing. They had endured years of deprivation, watched their comrades die of disease and starvation, maintained discipline and fighting spirit in impossible conditions, and all of it had been strategically meaningless. The war's outcome would have been identical if they had never existed. This realization that their sacrifice had not mattered was perhaps the cruelest aspect of MacArthur's strategy. Japanese military culture had prepared soldiers for death in battle. It had prepared them for suffering and deprivation. It had even prepared them for defeat, through the concept of Gyokusai dying gloriously while inflicting maximum damage on the enemy. But it had not prepared them for irrelevance. There was no cultural framework for understanding what it meant to have suffered greatly but uselessly, to have been willing to die but denied even that opportunity. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto, whose diary entries from Wewak were quoted earlier, survived the war and was repatriated to Japan in early 1946. In a post-war interview conducted by an American military historian in 1947, Yamamoto was asked what he thought about when he learned of Japan's surrender. His response was recorded, "I felt nothing. I had been expecting it for months. What surprised me was that I was still alive to hear it. So many of my comrades had died. I assumed I would die too. When I did not die, I did not know what to do with myself. I had prepared myself mentally for death. I had never prepared myself for surviving meaninglessly." This psychological aftermath extended beyond individual soldiers to the broader Japanese military establishment. The success of MacArthur's island-hopping strategy forced a fundamental reassessment of Japanese strategic doctrine. In the immediate post-war period, former Japanese officers analyzed what had gone wrong. The official histories produced by Japanese military historians in the late 1940s and early 1950s acknowledged that Japan had been strategically outmaneuvered, but they struggled to articulate exactly how it had happened. The core problem was that MacArthur had exploited a vulnerability in Japanese strategic thinking that Japanese planners had not even recognized as a vulnerability. Japanese doctrine assumed that territory had to be defended, that fortifications had to be reduced, that military forces could not simply be bypassed without creating unacceptable risk. These assumptions were so fundamental that they were rarely examined. MacArthur examined them, found them wanting, and discarded them. Japanese commanders, even after observing the pattern repeatedly, never fully adapted. They continued to defend positions that MacArthur had no intention of attacking, continued to concentrate forces that MacArthur would simply go around, continued to prepare for a kind of war that MacArthur refused to fight. The strategic lesson was clear but difficult to implement. In modern warfare, with sufficient mobility and logistical capability, attacking forces can bypass even the strongest defensive positions if those positions do not control something absolutely critical. Rabaul was strong, but it did not control anything that could not be controlled from elsewhere. Wewak was fortified, but it did not sit on a supply line that could not be rerouted. The Japanese had spent years building fortresses in locations that turned out to be strategically optional. This realization had broader implications beyond the Pacific War. Military theorists studying MacArthur's campaigns in the decades after the war recognized that he had demonstrated a principle that would become central to modern military thinking. Maneuver is more powerful than fortification. A force that can move freely can choose when and where to fight. A force fixed in defensive positions can only react. Given sufficient mobility and resources, the maneuvering force will almost always have the advantage, because it can concentrate overwhelming power at points of its choosing while bypassing enemy strong points. The United States military incorporated these lessons into its post-war doctrine. The emphasis shifted from frontal assaults and systematic territorial occupation to rapid maneuver and bypassing enemy strength. This approach would reappear in various forms in later conflicts in the left hook flanking maneuver during the Gulf War in 1991, in the rapid advance on Baghdad in 2003, in the counterinsurgency strategies that emphasized controlling key population centers rather than all territory. The intellectual lineage traces directly back to MacArthur's island-hopping campaigns, but the human cost of these strategies, both for the forces doing the bypassing and especially for those being bypassed, received less attention in military doctrine. The soldiers at Rabaul, Wewak, and dozens of other bypassed positions experienced a form of warfare that military culture had no language to describe. They were casualties of war, but not in the traditional sense. They were defeated, but not through combat. They suffered, but without the compensating narrative of having fought bravely. Their experience fell outside the categories that gave meaning to military sacrifice. In the decades after the war, as historians interviewed survivors and examined captured documents, a fuller picture emerged of what it meant psychologically to be on the receiving end of island hopping. The recurring themes were abandonment, meaninglessness, and a desperate search for narrative frameworks that could make sense of the experience. Some survivors embraced the idea that they had fought a spiritual battle, that maintaining discipline and morale in impossible conditions was itself a form of combat. Others simply tried to forget, rarely speaking about their war experience, because they had nothing conventionally heroic to relate. The physical toll on survivors was substantial. Men who had endured months or years of severe malnutrition often experienced permanent health effects. Beriberi caused lasting nerve damage. Repeated bouts of malaria left survivors vulnerable to recurrence for years afterward. Dental problems, from malnutrition and lack of care, plagued survivors for decades. But the psychological toll may have been worse. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not well understood in the 1940s and 50s, and the specific psychological damage caused by prolonged strategic irrelevance was not recognized at all. Some survivors struggled with survivor's guilt, intensified by the knowledge that their survival had no strategic meaning. In traditional combat, a soldier might take comfort from the idea that comrades had died for a purpose, that their sacrifice had contributed to some larger goal, even if the goal was ultimately not achieved. But soldiers from bypassed garrisons knew that their comrades had died for nothing, that if their entire garrison had vanished without a trace, the war's outcome would have been unchanged. This knowledge was corrosive. It undermined any attempt to find meaning in the experience. By the time Allied occupation forces began releasing Japanese prisoners and allowing repatriation in late 1945 and 1946, the full scale of casualties in bypassed garrisons was becoming clear. Over 150,000 Japanese military personnel had died in bypassed positions, approximately 1 in every 15 Japanese military deaths during the war. The vast majority had died from disease, starvation, and accidents rather than combat. This statistic represented an extraordinary success for MacArthur's strategy from a purely military standpoint. The Americans had neutralized over 150,000 enemy soldiers at essentially zero cost in American lives. But the statistic also represented something that troubled even some American commanders: a form of warfare that killed through neglect rather than combat. There was no moment when these soldiers were killed. They simply wasted away, forgotten by both sides. The moral dimensions of this were complicated. MacArthur had not set out to starve these garrisons. He simply bypassed them, and the starvation was a consequence of the bypass rather than its purpose. But the effect was the same. Some American military ethicists argued after the war that this form of warfare was actually more humane than direct assault would have been. Bypassing Rabaul, for instance, had avoided a battle that might have killed tens of thousands of Americans and Japanese in a matter of weeks. The slower deaths from starvation and disease at least gave individuals a chance to survive, even if that chance was slim. Others argued that there was something particularly cruel about leaving soldiers to die slowly, when quick defeat in combat would have been more merciful. These ethical debates never reached definitive conclusions, partly because they became intertwined with broader arguments about the Pacific War's conduct. By the late 1940s, attention had shifted to the atomic bombings, the firebombing of Japanese cities, and the question of whether Japan would have surrendered without these measures. The fate of bypassed garrisons became a footnote in larger debates. But for the men who survived those garrisons, the experience was not a footnote. It was the defining event of their lives. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually prospered, veterans from bypassed garrisons formed associations to maintain contact and preserve their experiences. These associations were smaller and less prominent than those formed by veterans who had participated in major battles. The bypassed garrisons had no famous moments to commemorate, no glorious last stands, no heroic sacrifices that fit conventional military narratives. What they had instead were stories of survival through endurance, of maintaining discipline when discipline seemed pointless, of continuing to function when function served no clear purpose, of staying human in conditions that eroded humanity. These were valuable stories, but they did not fit the cultural templates for refactions, war stories. They were stories about being forgotten rather than stories about being heroic. And so they were themselves often forgotten, overshadowed by more conventionally dramatic narratives from the war. MacArthur himself rarely discussed the bypassed garrisons in his post-war writings and speeches. His memoirs focused on the great campaigns, the return to the Philippines, the advance toward Japan, the occupation and reconstruction of Japan after surrender. The garrisons left behind were mentioned only in passing, as examples of efficient strategy, rather than as sites of human tragedy. This omission was telling. MacArthur understood the military significance of island hopping, but he seemed uninterested in or perhaps uncomfortable with its human cost for the bypassed Japanese forces. In the final analysis, MacArthur's island-hopping strategy represented both brilliant military innovation and profound human tragedy. From a strategic standpoint, it was nearly flawless. It achieved objectives with minimal friendly casualties, it shortened the war, and it demonstrated principles that would influence military thinking for generations. From a human standpoint, it created a category of warfare, the slow death of strategic irrelevance that military culture had no adequate framework for understanding. The Japanese soldiers, terrified by MacArthur's island hopping, were not terrified of dying. They had been prepared for death. They were terrified of not mattering, of dying meaninglessly, of suffering greatly but uselessly. That terror proved well-founded. They did suffer greatly. And strategically, their suffering achieved nothing. They had been edited out of the war's story while they were still in it, condemned to watch from the margins as the decisive events happened elsewhere. This was the genius and the cruelty of MacArthur's strategy. He had discovered that the most effective way to defeat an enemy is not always to destroy them. Sometimes it is simply to make of them irrelevant. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.